Washington Irving was the first internationally famous American literary celebrity, not counting Benjamin Franklin. He's probably best known for his story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow with the Headless Horseman. The story we're going to be studying is Rip Van Winkle. It's also a very famous story. Another thing that Washington Irving was really achieved fame for were his Christmas stories. He wrote about Saint Nicholas and old Christmas traditions from Europe, and really brought that to New York, where he lived, and a lot of the traditions we have in America today that we consider Christmas traditions actually came in part from Irving's writings. Irving was also the President Martin Van Buren appointed him as minister to Spain at one point in his career. He was ever the bachelor, sort of like his character Rip. Although Rip was married, he sort of lived like a bachelor in some ways to escape his wife. But he had a fiancée at one time, Matilda Hoffman, a 17-year-old daughter of his law professor, but she died in 1810, and Irving never married from then on. At one point, Mary Shelley, of Frankenstein fame, was romantically interested in Irving, but nothing ever came of that. Like his character, Rip Van Winkle, while Irving was universally loved, he was also perpetually broke. So Rip Van Winkle is in some ways a somewhat autobiographical character for Irving. And Irving really was one of the inventors of the American short story. By the way, a lot of what I'm drawing from on this lecture, you can find the kind of the skeleton of this on our modules in a document I have there under Washington Irving. It's called Notes on Washington Irving and Rip Van Winkle. So Rip Van Winkle really was the first American short story. Irving based it on an old German folktale. First thing I want to point out about the story is the scaffolding Irving uses. What I mean by scaffolding is, even though he bases it on a folktale, the story is fictional, but to lend to it a sense of authenticity, Irving pretends that he found the story among some papers by a historian named Knickerbocker, who really is just another character Irving invented. But this attempt to make the story seem authentic, you see that issue repeated in the story itself, even after that preface, the prefatory scaffolding, when he says, for instance, that did not lie so much among books as among men. So even if you couldn't find this story among books, you could speak to the people, and they would know the veracity of it. He says, legendary lore is so invaluable to true history, a book of unquestionable authority. He uses the phrase absolute fact, too well authenticated to admit of a doubt, beyond the possibility of a doubt. So in some ways you could say he's almost, like Hamlet says, protesting too much. But clearly Irving is interested in kind of the line between fiction and reality. When it first came out, Rip Van Winkle was appreciated less by the literary critics than it was, quote, by many folk, whose good opinion is well worth having And that may bring to mind what we saw in Benjamin Franklin, who had the same sentiments. Said, right, he was not critically acclaimed, but commercially successful. That his books brought him, as Franklin said it, good pudding. So what is it about the story that has captured Americans' imaginations for so long? I mean, it has an element of the supernatural, right? He takes this nap that ends up being several decades long. But the character himself, I think, is an interesting American prototype. He is Rip is sort of the prototypical henpecked husband. You know, the husband whose wife is domineering and controls him, you know, and so that kind of character, just throughout history, there's been a certain sympathy for that, for the henpecked husband. He's also the kind of the lovable loser, you know, as I say in the notes here, the lovable Peter Pan slacker in the late 90s, early 2000s. My Generation X popularized the slacker character. You think of any of a number of films by, oh gosh, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but the actor, maybe it'll come to me later. Is it Ben Rogen? Seth Rogen? Something, anyway. The man who never really grows up. He's perpetually stuck in adolescence. Now, on one hand, I'm not sure why that's an admirable character. Why is it admirable to never grow up and be responsible? But maybe it's the Peter Pan or the adolescent part of all of us, particularly in males, that somehow find some sympathy with that. Now, the darker interpretation of Rip's character is that he's an alcoholic neglecter of his family. I mean, he skips out on his family. I mean, you could argue he didn't mean to fall asleep for 30 years or however long it was, but again, another interpretation of the story is that he really did just skip town and made up this fabulous, story to gain sympathy from the people. And his dog, Rip's dog, reflects the same issue of being, domesticated versus wild, if you will. The dog's name is Wolf, which suggests he's wild, but in fact he's just as henpecked by the wife as Rip is. Let's see. There are a lot of different details we could talk about in the story, but let me just point out. Here's a quote that tells us right off on the first page. The narrator says, "I've observed that he was a simple, good-natured man," talking about Rip. "He was moreover a kind neighbor and an obedient, henpecked husband. The great error in Rip's composition," the narrator tells us on the next page, "was an insuperable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor." So it's this trait that causes the editor of our textbook, Levine, to describe Rip as kind of the anti Benjamin Franklin. Let me see if I can find that quote here. Robert Levine calls Rip, quote, "a counter-hero, an anti-Benjamin Franklin who made a success of failure." That Rip does end up in a way being a success in the story, but it's through sheer luck. Really, it's not through the kind of diligence of the Protestant work ethic that Franklin espoused. In fact, it's another thing that Irving does in the story is he points out how the old world leisurely pace changed to a new world hustle and bustle. So on page 37 here, it says, the very character of the people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it, instead of the accustomed phlegm and drowsy tranquility. And whereas Franklin, preferred the hustle and bustle and the industriousness to the old leisurely European way, Irving seems to be romanticizing the Rip's style, the being more leisurely and not so busy. Now, part of it may be that unlike Franklin, Washington Irving was born to wealth. It's easy to promote leisure when you literally can afford to have leisure because you're born into wealth. A few other things. The story, could lend itself to a kind of Freudian interpretation. There are different, what could be construed as phallic symbols, like the 9 pins, the bowling pins, the long knives, rusted flintlock, a tall naked pole with something on top that looked like a red nightcap. And again, that kind of Freudian interpretation might be apropos for the relationship between Rip and his wife, the Dame Van Winkle. That another thing about Rip is, unlike Franklin and some of these other American figures we've been reading, Rip is not a public statesman. I mean, ironically, he becomes popular among the young people in the town, but we're told he really doesn't have any interest in what's supposed to be kind of masculine interest of government and public affairs. So the public versus private, masculine versus feminine, the, quote, more important concerns of the election, we see on page 39. Rip is not really interested in that. It says Rip is more concerned with the tyrant, Dame Van Winkle, than with the tyrant, George III, that he feels more oppressed by the, quote, petticoat government, which, again, kind of a clever little phrase that is kind of showing a parallel between the private and the public, that just as, King George III was a tyrant in the view of the American revolutionaries, Dame Van Winkle is a tyrant in the interpersonal affairs of her and her husband. Let's see. I think that just about covers it. It says, Rip, in fact, was no politician. The changes of states and empires made but little impression on him. And so in some ways, he was a more feminine character, according to some of those stereotypes. And of course, part of that is you could argue he was emasculated by his wife, that she wore the pants in the family. So anyway, that's Rip Van Winkle. I hope that helped.